Updated May 31, 2018, 10 hours, 36 minutes and 37 seconds. Victorian dairy farmer Jill Porter is taking things one day at a time, but anger, frustration and fear spill over, just like her grief. "I hope that we survive, but we've suffered an enormous loss," she said, through tears. "I've lost half my herd, and the half that's remaining is sick and burned and crook, and on a day like that they'll produce 30 to 40% for their usual milk. It's enormous, the loss." She and her husband Brad have been struggling to run their Garvic dairy business ever since two devastating fires tore through the region on St. Patrick's Day. "It took everything. It took my cows. It took every tree. It took every fence. The dairy stood because of the CFA, Country Fire Authority. All our local men came, and we're just left with a mess to clean up." Locals believe the fire started when a power pole at the Kenna family's farm nearby snapped in high winds and fell to the ground just before 9 p.m. on March 17. Betty Kenna saw the fire running along and said it was suddenly hitting a tree, and it was just fireballs. Her voice trembles as she recalls that night and the ferocious wind. Her husband, Jack Kenna, woke to get his children out and alert his neighbors. "It's been gut-wrenching. It's been very hard mentally since the fires," he said. Mrs. Kenna said she felt sick in the stomach about what happened. "We know that it's not our fault, but it started here on our property and it's wiped half the countryside out." The pole is owned by Power Corps and had been reinforced some years before. The Kennas had never been concerned about it because you put your faith in whoever's looking after those poles, or owns those poles, Mrs. Kenna said. Investigators trace cause as class action looms. Frustration is growing across the region about the slow response of Power Corps, a firm majority owned by Hong Kong firm CK Holdings. "We want to fully understand why these electricity assets were involved, and we are cooperating with Energy Safe Victoria (ESV) as it investigates the Garvic and Terang fires," Power Corps said in statement. A preliminary report released this week by ESV, which focused on the fire at Terang, said it was caused by 4 short circuits in as many minutes at the town substation, in winds of more than 100 kilometers an hour. ESV found the most likely source of ignition was molten conductor material falling from clashing and arcing conductors during the high wind event. The investigation into the Garvic fire continues. The company has not admitted liability because of a class action suit being pursued by some affected farmers. "Given the current legal proceedings, we are unable to make further comment," it said in a statement. Power Corps said it was currently reviewing the report from ESV. Farmers face exhaustion. Edward Conhetti and his family run 5 dairies and a beef operation in the region. He recalls watching from afar as 2,000 tons of feed and 500 tons of hay on his property went up in flames. "The glow in the dark, in the sky. I'll never forget that. The whole sky was a red glow," he said. He's had to destroy cows whose feet and teats were blistered, replace feed, resow 80% of his paddocks and replace more than 30 kilometers of fencing. Cleanup and rebuilding coincided with calving season, which has meant 200 new calves to deal with on a fraction of the land he's used to. "People are starting their season now physically exhausted, and yet they're faced with this mammoth workload," he said. "I think that in itself is one of the biggest costs, and also the mental pressure. He cannot begin to calculate what he's lost, and the additional financial outlays. He will be covered in part by insurance. We're still going to have a very significant shortfall. Now, if anyone is proven to be negligent or whatever, I only hope that is done in a fair way," he said. At the Kenna family property, Power Corps replaced the pole right after the fire, but the Kennas have heard little from the company since. "If it's found that there is a settlement, we can't afford to wait for 6 or 7 years. It's got to be pretty much straight away," Mr. Kenna said. "We should be compensated 100% because that's the way it should be if you're going to be fair about it," he said. Some kind of third-party watchdog was needed to oversee the process, otherwise money due to farmers would be lost in fees for lawyers and others. "It has to happen because the system as it is now is broken, as far as compensation goes, and it needs to be fixed," he said. No compensating a broken spirit. Jill and Brad Porter want to see action too. All of those power assets were government-owned, Mrs. Porter said. They, the government, should poke and prod them. They should advocate for us. Ms. Porter said she didn't have the energy or the time to deal with the paperwork to make a claim for government assistance or loans. She said she wanted the people at Power Core to see for themselves what farming families were going through. Maybe they need to come out of Melbourne and come down here, and they actually need to see the hours you work, the time you put into your cattle, Mrs. Porter said. Perhaps they need to speak to my husband. You can't ever be compensated for a broken spirit. Topics: bushfire, fires, disasters and accidents, farm labor, rural, GARVOC 3265, TERANG 3264, Cobden 3266. Pic first posted May 31, 2018, 6 hours 26 minutes and 20 seconds.